Hello and welcome to The World Today on Channels Television. I'm Cynthia Ara. Here are our top stories. We begin with the Islamic State. The U.S. President Barack Obama has condemned the killing of U.S. aid worker Abdul Rahman Kassig, calling it an act of pure evil. The militant group ISIS released a video showing a masked man standing over a severed head, which the White House confirmed was Mr. Kassig's. Western intelligence officials are now trying to identify the militant seen in the video that shows the beheading. According to the French Interior Minister, one of the militants is likely to be a 22-year-old Frenchman named Maxime Houchard, and another is reportedly a Briton, but his father says it's unclear if the video shows that it's actually his son, who could be 20-year-old Nasser Muthana. Mr. Kassig was just 26 years old when he was killed.
ISIS has continued to do what they know to do best, battling for strategic towns and the killing of hostages. It was indeed unfortunate, but U.S. aid worker Peter Kassig has become the fifth person to be beheaded by the Islamic State, and he was remembered on Sunday for his courageous devotion to helping the Syrian people. His parents, Ed and Paula Kassig, who in an October video pleaded for their son's freedom, released a statement saying, quote, "We are incredibly proud of our son for living his life according to his humanitarian calling." U.S. President Barack Obama confirmed the Indiana native's death, praising him for his humanitarian activities while referring to his murder as an act of pure evil. Hours after the U.S. government confirmed the incident, New York senior Senator Charles Schumer called on Congress to approve President Barack Obama's funding request for increased military spending against the Islamic State.
ISIS is an evil, evil operation. We have to do everything to stop it. We just saw what they did once again. The barbarity has rarely been seen in modern society of this group. Now, there's something we can do. The president has asked for an allocation to train, not for boots on the ground, combat boots on the ground, I'd be opposed to that, but to train Iraqi troops and to augment the air war against ISIS, which has been very successful. I hope in the next 2 weeks Congress will approve that fund and not delay. This beheading shows that we have to do everything we can against ISIS, and these funds are needed to keep the air war going, and not for boots on the ground, but to train Iraqi troops so they can fight ISIS better.
Meanwhile, fighting continues in Kobani, with occasional plumes of smoke rising from the besieged border town. Kobani has become a symbolic test of the U.S.-led coalition's ability to hold the advance of the Islamic State, which has poured weapons and fighters into its assault of a town that has lasted almost 2 months. Kobani has been encircled by the Sunni Muslim insurgents for more than 50 days. Weeks of U.S.-led airstrikes have failed to break the militant stranglehold, and Kurds are hoping the arrival of the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga forces, welcomed by Washington, will turn the tide. The Peshmerga have helped forces in Kobani take control of some villages around it, but have not yet altered the lines of control inside the town. U.S. Central Command said in a statement on Friday, November 14th, that 17 strikes near Kobani destroyed 10 fighting positions, a building, and several vehicles, in addition to striking militant units. Altogether, the latest U.S.-led strikes conducted from Wednesday, November the 12th, to Friday included 19 airstrikes against Islamic State in Syria and 16 strikes against the militant group in Iraq.
For more on what's happening concerning ISIS, I'm now being joined live from Washington, D.C. by Elizabeth Arrott. She'll be speaking to us now on Skype. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on The World Today. I hope you can hear us.
Yes, we can. Good to be with you, Cynthia.
Thank you. Now, I'd just like to start by asking you if you have any word on how far the U.S. has come in identifying the killers of Kassig and also the 18 Syrian prisoners.
It's not clear. We haven't had any. We've just had a verification that it was an authentic video, but not who the people were. As you mentioned in the previous reporting, the French and British reports, French intelligence, the father of the British man, seem to have identified those two people. The rest of them, and there were about a dozen other people who came out and killed those other men, the 12 men who were identified as Syrian soldiers. There doesn't seem to be any further identification at this point.
Now, this video is quite different from the 4 previous ones that we've seen in the past. It seems to be a deliberate taunt targeted at the West. What do you think is the motive in this case?
Well, you're quite right. It is different in several respects. For one, we didn't get a statement, which we had in the previous 4 videos of the killings of Western hostages. Those were made under, very likely under duress, criticizing the West, and we didn't actually see, there was no video of the killing of Mr. Kassig. There was also no bringing forward the next victim. So it does break with many of the patterns that we have seen in them, and I think the motive is still very much the same, is to show that their power and that they have these Western hostages. But there is something, and people aren't quite sure what to make of it. There is only one known Western hostage still in their hands, and that person's fate, it's a female aid worker who has not been identified. It's not clear if that puts them more on the spot and what their next steps would be, but they have gone ahead, and that in itself, especially with a Muslim, killing a Muslim, and it seems to have been kind of a big departure for them.
Now, finally, before I let you go, Elizabeth, since you're in the United States, are there any new moves being made by the government to ensure that there's no other casualty like Kassig and also Foley and the rest?
There has not been any change in the U.S. policy, which is also shared by Britain, of not doing any negotiations with hostages. So that remains in place. If there's things behind the scenes, obviously they're not going to be able to tell us now, but they have stuck with that strategy of not dealing and any negotiating, with other countries have done and been able to release their hostages.
The VOA's Elizabeth Arrott, thank you very much.
I've
been talking to her from Washington, D.C., and she's been telling us more on ISIS. Now, in other news, the meeting of the G20 leaders in Brisbane, Australia, has ended, capping a week of regional summits that have been full of awkward moments between President Barack Obama and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Our colleague at the VOA, Louis Ramirez, who is the White House correspondent, is traveling with President Obama and has this report.
As fighting intensified in Ukraine, a recently divorced President Putin appeared to be on a charm offensive, starting at the APEC summit in Beijing, where cameras caught him putting a shawl on the wife of Chinese President Xi Jinping, which her aides promptly replaced. But it was the informal but uncomfortable encounters between the Russian and U.S. leaders, in which they looked in each other's direction but not at each other, that made the news. There were no smiles behind the scenes, as the 2 leaders spent a total of about 15 minutes together. Ukraine topped the conversations. At the G20 in Brisbane, Mr. Obama did not waste the chance to further isolate Mr. Putin. There, the 2 leaders had more encounters.
I would characterize them as typical of our interactions, which are businesslike and blunt.
The Australians showed Mr. Putin the same hospitality they showed other leaders. They let him hold and pet their koalas, just as President Obama got to do. But no one here in Australia has forgotten that Russia is blamed for the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 that killed 298 people, including 28 Australians. President Obama joined leaders of Japan and Australia, who voiced their opposition to Russia's actions in Ukraine and called for those who brought the Malaysia plane down to be brought to justice. Throughout the G20, there were smiles and handshakes, but little mincing of words. At a private meeting, Canada's Stephen Harper told Mr. Putin, "I guess I'll shake your hand, but I have only one thing to say to you. You need to get out of Ukraine." In his remarks Sunday, President Obama offered Mr. Putin a way back to better relations.
My communications to him was no different than what I've said publicly, as well as what I've said to him privately over the course of this crisis in Ukraine. And that is, Russia has the opportunity to take a different path.
While other leaders remained in Brisbane until after lunch Sunday, Mr. Putin was among the first to leave the gathering.